Well, hello there. How's it going, everybody? Today, we're gonna go over my 50 Claude Code tips. I've been working with Claude Code basically every day for about 6 months now, and I feel like I've learned a ton of things. And yes, I am one of those engineers that are basically not writing code anymore. I'm still in Claude Code like 12 hours a day, actively pair programming with Claude Code basically, and reviewing a ton of code. I still read every single line of code. That's actually my biggest bottleneck right now, the reviewing of the code. But I thought it would be great to show you kind of the best tips that I've learned along the way. And these are kind of tips that I wish I knew when I was first getting started. We're gonna start off with some foundation stuff like setting up, very quick setup stuff, a little bit about like Claude.md rules, like what you should put in, what you should think about, and kind of some of the advanced stuff for later. But without further ado, let's dive into 50 Claude Code tips. So I got my terminal here and I just have some slides behind to tell you guys what I'm doing. So here is the foundations that I mentioned. We're gonna cover getting started, keyboard shortcuts, some essential like slash commands, and a little bit of a deep dive into the Claude.md. So let's get started. All right. So for tip number 1, you want to run Claude Code in your root directory of whatever project you're working on. So for example, I have this Pomodoro app that I'm like kind of been working on. So I'll type in like Claude here. And that's essentially how you get started. And you really want to do this because later we'll talk about this, but if you have rule files or any kind of setup, the initial root directory is where Claude is going to zip up the context into that first token. So if you ever wonder why you had a bunch of tokens used, even though you just opened up Claude, this is probably the reason why. It's because Claude's getting your project ready. All right, so one of the first things that you want to do is run /init like that. And what this does is Claude will go and look at your code base and do an analysis of your code base and then create that initial Claude.md file in the .claude directory of your code base. Now, there's like different directories that you could source from, like you could have a global one or like this one. But yeah, at a high level, what this is doing right now is it's just looking at the code base, looking for the architecture, and then basically it's creating that Claude.md. All right, so it just finished. It does take some time, and as you can see, it's kind of going and saying, oh, this is like a Next.js 15 app. It's like a portfolio site. But yeah, it's just going over high level things about this particular project. And then you could just essentially hit yes to commit that to your .claude. So this is like really important for new projects, so I highly recommend you to run it. All right, so the tip number 2 is that Claude.md file that we just created, it kind of runs on a hierarchy. So if you go to memory/memory, you could kind of see right here that there is a checked in memory, which is the current root directory, and then there's a user memory. This is like your global one. So that's like in your tilde.claude/Claude. So you could kind of choose between it, but it's really there so you can know what the core rule that the Claude Code is operating on right now. Looking at the Claude.md that Claude just created, like this is a pretty good one to get started, right? It just has like, you don't want it to be too large. It's like very small, right? I think around 300 lines is about a decent place that you want to aim for. And to be honest, going larger is fine, but just remember that every time you increase that initial context window, you're going to use more tokens, first of all, but also the more bloat you have in your context, the less likely the AI will do exactly what you're trying to do. All right. So for structure and what you should be thinking about putting into your Claude.md, I just opened another project. This one is my anime Pomodoro. This is an iOS app, so I wanted to show you a little bit more examples. But basically, the things I like to put is like high-level technical architecture and the requirements, you know, like what is the project? Like that's kind of important. And then you want to give it like some domain context, right? Like, oh, it's using Swift UI, and I probably would add high-level architecture and like kind of the file path and things like that. And just some of the high-level design patterns, like you'll see, like all of that should go in here. And then one of the important thing is kind of having your build flow, like your validation flow. And this is like kind of where my build and validation is. So you can see that I'll like build the Xcode and then build a project, make sure things compile. Just having this loop of validation is so amazing because the AI will just be able to self-improve and keep going until it fixes itself. So like if you're ever in a situation where you just like ask cursor to do something or ask some AI code agent to do something and it just doesn't work, a lot of that gets resolved when you fix the validation. And validation, I think as a side tip, is probably one of the most important topics that you should really think about when you're thinking about trying to build good AI agentic like coding systems or any workflows. Is really what is the validation loop, because that will dramatically improve how good your AI will be. All right, so let's go to some keyboard shortcuts. And the reason why I even have this entire section for this is because if you're gonna be in Claude Code all day, every day, like if you're an engineer, you're just gonna be on this workhorse for quite a while. So you should learn how to actually use most useful hotkeys. And there's essentially Shift+Tab toggle modes is pretty useful. And that's just like hitting Shift and Tab. And then you can see right here that we're switching from accept edits to plan mode. I actually use plan mode quite heavily. I think I use plan mode almost exclusively whenever I start a new feature. It's rare that I start in edit mode. I always just want to verify and double check that my assumptions about the code base that I'm working on and the direction that I'm trying to go with is the best option. So I usually start in plan mode and I spend a decent amount of time before I go to accept and just like start execution. All right, escape interrupts. Let me just get something started here. Tell me a good way to plan a live activity for when I background the app. Okay, so I'm gonna let this go to show you guys what escaping the interrupts is, but you can see that Claude is like thinking here and it's like going through and doing things. Sometimes if, especially during plan mode, you want to kind of like look at this and look at the thinking and see if it's going off track. If it is, you just hit escape and then it interrupts. Now, a lot of people might be like kind of like scared to interrupt it, but you can just like hit up and then go right back to where you're doing. Or you could just interrupt it and tell it something else. The whole point is Claude Code has a really good way of like deduping and entering prompts in a nice queue. It logically knows what to do. So you don't have to be so scared to like enter more than one prompt and also like escaping early and interrupting and changing course. Like it's actually recommended to do that. Tip number 8 is if you ever had something like really big or you copy pasted something and you're like, oh, I don't want to delete everything. A handy shortcut here is just double tap escape and it'll clear the input. There's also a Vim mode if you're into that, but I use this all the time. Another thing is when you're on an empty input, if you double tap escape, you'll see that you can rewind to like a previous point and then restore that context point. This is kind of common with Claude Code, but a lot of the tools I feel like is really built to manage your context and context engineering. And then there's just like an agent that is wrapped around the orchestration. But a lot of the like slash commands and stuff that we'll be going over, I feel like it's really to manage that context window. All right, screenshots is obviously a pretty common thing to do. There's a lot of ways to do it, but you can essentially take a screenshot and then drag it over and just drop it in. And then obviously another good tip is to add context. This is a cool picture of the Claude Code mascot. Do something with it. I don't know. But yeah, so that's a really good example of like taking a screenshot and bringing it over. If you are doing any kind of UI work, you'll definitely use this workflow. I also highly recommend finding like a Figma MCP or some form of MCP that works really good with the specific validation that you're trying to do. All right. Moving on to essential commands, and this is slash commands. Before I end on the keyboard shortcuts, there's a lot more keyboard shortcuts, things that I don't use all the time. If you just go to like slash help, you'll be able to see a bunch of them. But the ones that I covered, I use all the time, every day. So definitely just memorize it. I think it would be really useful. Now, essential commands is like the slash commands that I think you should know about. There's way more slash commands and you could like make your own slash commands, but these are the ones that I think is useful. All right, so slash clear is basically a way to clear the context. Now you could actually do this by just creating another instance of Claude, right? That's basically the same thing, But if you don't want to like do that, you could just clear the context. And this is really good if you want to start a new feature and you're completely done with the old task and you don't want the old context to blow up the new context and influence the new project that you're doing. All right, so I just loaded some stuff. Let's go into /context. What this does is it will give you like a visual representation of the current context that Claude Code is operating in. Now, why is this useful? So the main reason why this is useful is because it gives you an opportunity to reason about the context that Claude Code is making assumptions on your code base. Now, I always say context is best served fresh and condensed, and you really want to take a look at this from time to time. If you ever felt like Claude Code has regressed and like things are not working the way it is, or your like cost and usage like bill is going up, you really want to look at this and then see which are like the most biggest offenders, right? You just want to like audit it. Like MCPs are one of those very common things that blows up your tokens. I mean, like look at all of this Xcode related MCPs, and every time it runs, it like, I mean, these are not a lot because I haven't been doing that much in this particular workflow, but you could just imagine that once I start doing those iteration cycles, this like usage will like blow up. But yeah, so if you look at this and you're like, oh, this MCP is using so much, then you could remove it or just disable it for this directory. So /context is something that you probably should not ignore. Again, I think Claude Code, all of the tools is really there to manage a lot of the context and doing really good context engineering. So this is a good / command. All right, so in terms of compaction, like if you use Claude Code at all, if you had a long session, it will start auto-compacting at some point. All auto-compaction does is it takes your current context window, like context that you created, and then it will just summarize it. And then it does a pretty good job. For my projects, I usually just let the auto-compaction work, but if you really want to compact what you have right now, you could just compact. But I rarely use this. The only time I use this is if I want to save some version of my context into like my local like second brain. If you haven't seen that video, go and check it out. But I have this second brain concept when I work on projects, and that's where that goes. So for /models, this is like very useful, I think, if you have unlimited tokens. Like if you're doing this at work, for me, I usually just default it to Opus 4.5. But if you're very like cost sensitive and you know certain workflows work well in Sonnet or like Haiku, then you could just go and change that. Keeping it at default is fine too, but I would try to use Opus as much as possible. All right, so /resume is really useful if you accidentally like lost your instance. Let's say you created another one and then you accidentally killed it or something like that, right? Oh, you killed the wrong one or something. Then when you go back into Claude Code, you could do /resume like so. And then it'll give you kind of the old context, and then you could like recover your context so that you don't lose all the work that you did in building up that context window. All right, /MCP is really about showing the MCPs that you have installed. If I have to be honest, I try very, very hard to not use MCPs because I think they blow up your context window. So I only install ones that are needed for that very specific project. And I try to just leverage Claude Code and write scripts and like these kind of things manually, like myself, to do the validations and things like that. But some projects, you just do need MCPs, like this Xcode one, you kind of need it. And for other projects like my Next.js apps, I have like a whole set of MCPs for that. But just be careful with MCPs. But it's a really fantastic way to teach Claude how to do certain things, especially with like third-party software and things like that. You know, it's a protocol, right? Model context protocol. So it's basically used everywhere. But again, it's known to blow up your token usage and your context window. So just be careful. All right. So /help is the last thing I'm going to teach you. You know, teach a man how to fish. So this like little wizard here will just teach you what they are and give you like descriptions of everything. So just go ahead and like try these out and just take a look and, you know, explore. All right. So the next thing is around Git. So you could ask Claude Code to manage your Git. I think there's a bunch of like skills you could download to Claude Code to manage all your Git. And I think that's something that you should do. Like I write a lot of my summaries and test plans all using like Claude Code now. Obviously, I have my own templates that I wrote, so Claude kind of sounds more like me and it's not too verbose and things like that. So I highly recommend you to use Git as a safety net. There is actually a rewind feature, like I think I told you, where you can restore the code and the conversation, but this is a little confusing to me. Like Git is just better. I use this as like a last resort if I didn't have Git. For a certain checkpoint. So now that you know how to just navigate around Claude Code and things like that, and just kind of high level important like commands and things like that, I think it's a good time to deep dive into the Claude.md file. I think for most people, most users, like 80% of users, if you just have a really good Claude.md file for your project, you could get really, really far without learning like all the advanced stuff. Just having a really good rules file will save you a lot of headaches. Let's kind of dive a little bit deep into this. Okay, so one of the most important things in the Claude.md files is, first of all, it's like it actually reads top to bottom and it keeps the priority from top to bottom. I think that's like a very small nuance. I'm pretty sure that's true. I think I read that somewhere. But yeah, so you want to go top to bottom as like important to least important. And you want to add things that are like never do something, but always do this. And then have like clear snippets of examples. I think is really good. And I don't have that many on this particular project because it's stock Swift UI, but the context here is that you should really think about how unique is your project. How many things about your project is like homegrown and essentially like the AI may have never seen. Like remember, a lot of this code is like basically a lot of the AI like coding is basically just an accumulation of like the best code that the AI is trained on. So it might not know your like super special DSL language that you created or like some random archaic patterns that your company has. And that's where you'll be like, oh, why is the AI never doing this? So whenever you run into something like that, you want to fix it manually and then you just update your Claude.md rules so that it never does that mistake again. Think of it as like lint files kind of. And then when you ask Claude to update the rules, you shouldn't ever do it manually. You should just go here into Claude and say, hey, can you update that rule for me so we never do it again? Something like that. Like as simple as that will go and update your Claude.md files. You see how it's trying to do it? Obviously, there's nothing that I just did, so it has nothing to add. But yeah, okay, it added something that it thought. But you get the point. All right, so this next one is really around using like keywords to trigger your skills. So basically, I have these like build commands inside of my rules. So when I say, hey, use my Xcode MCP to build, it'll try to build the app, for example. Use my Xcode MCP to build the app. Okay, my whisper stuff is like failing a little bit, but maybe you'll get the gist of it from build the app. And as you can see, it's asking if I can use the Xcode build MCP. So that's kind of the high level of like using skills and like trigger words to be able to trigger certain behavior. This next one is something called like compound engineering. That's like kind of a new term that is being discussed, but it's essentially to take your Claude.md and start like committing it into the code base. Now, obviously, you need to get rid of anything that's like generic for your code, like file paths and things like that. And you also want to be mindful of how large this file becomes, right? Because like I said, every time someone hits Claude in that directory or Claude is trying to read that directory, it will load that Claude.md file. So you don't want to blow up other people's context windows. So you really want to have this be like a high bar when you're committing it. But the nice thing is once that's in, you essentially make that AI coding experience better for your teammates. But you just need to make sure that whatever you're landing is actually helping. There's a lot of school of thoughts around this right now. I don't think it's like completely solved, but there's got to be some form of evaluation here. And a lot of people are just using like vibes. So you just like test it for like a few weeks and then you just try to land it and then ask for feedback essentially. So dangerously skip is essentially like Claude Code in YOLO mode. Like just basically if you use Claude Code, it'll ask you to accept a bunch of stuff. It could get really annoying. So a lot of people, they use, Claude and then dash dash dangerously skip. Okay, so it's dash dash dangerously skip permissions. And when you run this, Claude Code will no longer ask you essentially to accept edit. I think it will completely just ignore it, except for like anything you put into your slash permissions, which we'll talk about. But you only really want to do this in environments that you can kind of throw away and you're doing specific work that is not like super dangerous. Like if you're going to start touching the OS and stuff like that, you could really mess it up. I messed up some of my Linux machines because I was just going too aggressive and I was just testing it out and I was trying to set up some of my Linux stuff using Claude Code. And then like I had to reflash the entire thing. Like I said, you can use slash permissions here to kind of like tell which ones are like you still want to accept. So it does, like rm-rf or something, like don't do that. Or yeah, just like mutations, like just be careful with mutations, like deletion mutations, right? All right. The next big one, I think, now that we talked a little bit about the Claude.md rule files, I think we should talk about workflows because I have a very specific way I like to work, and I've actually refactored my entire work so that it works with Claude Code. I used to use Cursor or like Android Studios mostly and VS Code to do a lot of coding and stuff like that, but I dropped basically all of that and I use just iTerms now. Some people use obviously Vim, but I think iTerms is fine. So I'm gonna show you guys a few things. So like I said, I always start with plan mode. Let's go and like plan like a little feature for this Pomodoro app that I've been like kind of working on. I don't know, I actually need to remove a bunch of audio stuff. So let's just say audit my code base and make sure that we're removing all of the audio playback and references to the audio part of the Pomodoro app. I'll always start with plan mode and I'm like iterating with Claude Code. I'm arguing with it. I'm having a conversation with it. Claude Code, you're so beautiful. You're so amazing. No, but like I'm really treating it as like another like just good engineer that I'm like working with. And I never just like purely accept the first answers that it gives to me. I'm always kind of challenging it. And I spend a lot of time and put a lot of effort at this stage of the development. Because I feel like once Claude Code builds up that context and have good execution specs, the generation of the code is actually the easy part. And I do want to take a moment and talk about like kind of the news cycle about people saying, oh, like people are no longer writing code. I think like the creator of Node.js said like the era of like people writing code by hand is essentially over. And I actually truly believe that. And the thing is, I love like being in the zone and writing code. At least I used to. The thing is, it's really hard to get back into that mode. It's like very different levels of abstractions of the way you're working. And right now, I'm just doing one instance of it, but you could imagine just having like multiple Claude instances like this, and then you're just actively working on a bunch of different things at the same time. Because you have this like new superpower, the new next level of engineering is really like jumping between Claude instances and really context engineering that instance and then getting it good enough to start executing. And I keep talking about this like context, right? And this tip is really around like fresh context beats like bloated context. I think I kind of covered this throughout this, but that's why you want to start with plan mode, make sure it's good, and then just go and execute. Instead of like having a bunch of like, try this and then try that and then try this and then try that. Like that will just bloat that context, and then the AI will get really confused at some point because it can't remember what part of what was good and not good. So that's why you want to spend the time in the beginning building up the good context, have a good plan doc. So it always has something that initially was good to reference. And then it builds little by little. All right, so this next one is really around persisting that context. I have a full video on this about like the second brain concept. So I'll link it here. But the idea here is that let's say you finish something, you could just say, save this to my local Claude.md in my projects directory. Save the work that we just did. So you could say something like that. And then I essentially have a full workflow for this to manage this. But yeah, you could do that. Load my context from my local projects. So once you have that second brain concept, you could say a command like this, and it will pull that context and then load it for your new session. So here's a good example. I like to do a lot of my to-dos inside of Claude Code itself. These are kind of the high level things that I still need to do for this next feature that I'm working on. So I'm like working on a widget for this Pomodoro app, and I have like a live activity, for example. And I'm also like deleting all the music stuff because I don't think it adds value. So I have a bunch of stuff that I'm tracking, but because I keep all the to-dos in my local index like that I'm lazy loading, I don't always load it. I only lazy load it when I ask for it. It allows me to like context switch from project to project without like carrying around like complex, I don't know, Asana boards or whatever. I just keep it all in here. And this works because it's my own project. But you can technically do this with like an MCP with Asana or I don't know, Jira or whatever, as long as you can, whatever project management that you can think of. All right, so I think we covered this a little bit, but really think about the build cycle. Like obviously if you're mobile, think about Xcode, building the Xcode, but there's a lot of other workflows that you could think of. Like for example, you could ask Claude Code to, like, let's say you're debugging something that's like kind of tricky, has like race conditions or things like that. You could ask Claude Code to like add debug logs, for example, and then run the app and then have Claude Code control the emulator. You could just ask it to do that and then like do the actions that you're trying to do and then read the logs through a tail log or something and then debug that way. Or you could use like Perfetto or something like that for kind of performance things. You could hook into Perfetto MCPs, do a run, and then have it read the traces and then see if it can find jank just from like the timings, right? There's just so many validation loops that you could think of. Like for web, you could do like Puppeteer and have Claude navigate it using a /Chrome command and then just actually do the navigation, or have it write just tests, or have like integration, end-to-end integration tests. You know, there's a lot of things that Claude Code could do, and it really is up to your imagination. But it's the single most important thing, in my opinion, if you want to have a more automated loop that like generates good code on like the first try. So going back to the /models, really just consider using Opus if you can afford it. It's just the best way. All of these are a little bit slower, but because the way I work is I have multiple Claude instances. Obviously, it's like very small right in here, but I have multiple Claude instances running at all times. And then the way I work is basically just juggling these Claude instances. So even if one of them takes a long time, it doesn't matter because I'm like, I gave the command and I go to the next one, I'm building the context, I give a command and I go to the other one and then I give a command. So like you end up like still can get into the zone, but it's like a different style. So I talked a little bit about interrupting earlier, but you really want to like look out for like assumptions, or the keywords are like, oh, I'm not really sure, or you'll see like errors happening. I'm having a hard time like getting it to do this in this example, but just know that like when you go and look for the best ways to delete an app, I don't know. I'm just giving it a random prompt to try to make it go off course. But if you see it going and making assumptions about certain things, okay, this time it didn't even really, because it's just new. But you should just interrupt it like that, you know, and then just course correct it. So don't worry about course correcting. Okay, so the next section is around power users. I don't really like to say power users, but most people that I've talked to don't really know like the differences between a / command or a skill. They're kind of interchangeable now. And MCPs, subagents, you know, post hooks, pre hooks, like these kind of primitives that Claude Code is like known for and kind of like invented. And we're gonna cover some of that and how these are all like composable in nature. Okay, So I call it the composability framework, but I just really wanted to highlight that these are composable more than anything. But there's 4 primitive like composable things. All the slash commands are technically composable with each other, not directly each other, but anyways. So we're gonna just go over the fact that like how these are composable, okay? So let's first talk about skills. All a skill is like you do a workflow. So let's say that I tell Claude, go and fetch Hacker News for latest iOS news. So let's say I tell it to go and fetch Hacker News for the latest iOS news, and then I tell it to save that. Okay, and then save a summary to my local Claude.md, Claude directory. Okay, I misspelled that, but basically, let's say that it went and found some, and then it's save it into my local directory. Let's say I wanted to build a skill around that. So you just saw me do 2 things. One is fetch something from a source like Hacker News, and then save that thing to my local directory. That's technically a workflow. So all you have to do is save what we just did into a new skill called fetch Hacker News. And that's basically it to create a skill. It's basically a recurring workflow that you can just tell Claude to remember. And behind the scenes, it's actually just an MD file, as you can see right here. Oops. And as you can see here, it's literally just a system prompt. It's an MD file, but Claude has specific directories that is looking for skills, and it will be able to infer this next time I say, go fetch something from Hacker News, or use my Hacker News skill to fetch articles. Yeah, and then commands is basically now interchangeable. It's a pretty recent change, but you can see that skills is written into the skills documentary, and there's also now a slash command called slash fetch Hacker News. This is a very recent change from Anthropic, where they kind of like combined commands and skills. But yeah, so now you can just do slash Hacker News, and then now it'll rerun that system prompt. For example, it added like an additional like assumption thing. That's pretty cool. It's not exactly what I did, but it kind of inferred that I would probably want that. So those are the little cool things. And the thing is, you could update these anytime you want. You know, you could just ask Claude to do something else. All right, so like I said, you never want to manually create these kind of stuff. You want to get in the habit of asking Claude to update and manage these skills. So we could say, why don't you extend this fetch Hacker News to fetch Twitter or Apple News, for example. Now, sometimes it won't work 100% exactly right. Okay, so you see this, it doesn't have Twitter authentication access. So it's trying to just do some other ways. Yeah, multiple sources. So you can see how it's all updating that system prompt that we wrote, right? And then fetch Hacker News and so forth. You get the idea. All right. So MCPs, I think we covered it a little bit during the rules, but basically MCPs, you just want to find MCPs like this, right? Like they're just model contexts. But kind of a hack is like you don't actually need to search the web for an MCP. You could just be like, find me a good Figma MCP. You could just ask Claude to find it for you, and then most of the time it does a good job. The only thing is like sometimes it's outdated, so it'll like know of one that's like was popular a little while ago rather than doing a web search. So you just have to be mindful, and that's why I'm saying like for certain actions you want to read what it's doing and look at the thinking, and then cancel it if you want to. And you could have Claude also install the MCP, so you don't have to like manage like the configs and stuff yourself like you had to with Cursor. Yeah, so you could ask Claude to install the MCPs. So like right here, it says, go and do this, right? But instead I could just be like, why don't you just install this for me? For example, and then it will just go and install it for you. All right, so in terms of subagents, I don't know if I have one for this. I might have like an iOS, I might have one like an iOS like context gathering or like architecture agent. Let me try it. So spawn a iOS architecture agent, subagent, and do some investigation on my code base and see if it's actually good or not. So you can build subagents just like you can with slash commands and skills. All you do is just ask it to make a subagent after you do the work once. The main reason why you want to create a subagent is really to do parallel work, but also it's to protect your context window. So like I said, one of the key features of Claude Code is to manage your context and do context engineering, and subagent is a huge way. And I think a lot of people are using subagents incorrectly because they do things like this, where you have like an iOS subagent, right? By the way, it's not triggering the subagent. I'll just make one after it creates it and show you guys what it looks like. It like highlights it in like a different color. But a lot of them have this like workflow where they'll tell it to go do something that does the context gathering, and then they ask to like bring it back. But that portion of the context that's brings back from the subagent, it's only like the output. It's not like how it got there. So it doesn't have the full context. So for those kind of works, I usually just keep it within the context window because those are the things that are really good. Use what we just did to create a iOS architecture subagent. But yeah, so oftentimes people mistake that you want to like have a validator agent, you want to have like a testing agent and all these kind of things, but I try to keep all the things that need that context to do its work within the same Claude Code session. Because like a good testing agent needs to know about the code that it wrote most of the time, in my opinion. Of course, sometimes things could live in isolation. So what are really good things for subagents is really just like things that are atomic in nature that you want to just have it run as side effects and just go and do. But yeah, so that's what I use subagents for. I don't use subagents that often. I know some people like love using them, but one of the most common like clowny kind of use cases that I've seen is like CEO agent, product agent, design agent, and stuff like that. And I don't really believe in that particular workflow. Like you really want to have this concept of bringing the work to the context rather than trying to spread out the context that gets created. All right, so, and this kind of ties into it, like you want to avoid like having a lot of instructions and overloading the context all the time. You want to keep your context condensed and fresh. So that, watch my video on the second brain, and you like it'll teach you a lot about like lazy loading and then having this like ongoing project domain thing that builds over time, and you want to essentially use that as your RAG system to build like a good context and then be able to just have fresh and good context all the time for your AI to execute on. All right, so here is some interesting like advanced workflows, and I really think that the big game changer, in my opinion, for Claude Code and why I think Claude Code is just so amazing is that you can do a lot of parallel development. This is why I had to like fully change how I work using like terminal and stuff, because you could run multiple instances. And I already kind of showed you guys this, but you could just swap between these and just have like multiple things running at the same time. So I could say start working on my live activities feature. So I could just have that. Obviously, I would do it in plan mode, but I'm just showing you guys. And then over here, I could just say, all right, let's test out this iOS architecture and then just spawn a subagent. So as you can see, I'm doing some investigation on one side and then I'm doing live code editing. But the thing is, I could always just create another one, go to like a different project like this. And then now I could be saying, hey, I want to work on a new newsletter, for example. So I could be doing a bunch of stuff all at the same time. So that's like so understanding how to juggle this and doing it effectively, I think is like the next step function change. And I just want to kind of shout out iTerms. I think it's like really good because, you could do Command D to create new instances like this, right? And then you could juggle between the terminals using command, the left bracket and right bracket. Like ignore this like slash. It's like I'm just saying, oh, it's left bracket or right bracket, like slash, right? But yeah, so, and you could do that. You could also, if you have multiple tabs like this, you can actually swap between it. And at work, what I do is I rename like what I'm doing in here. Like I'll say local, and maybe here I'll say like remote SSH or something like that. And then from the remote SSH, I could have Claude like running like this, and I could spawn a more, you know, and then I could just be going back and forth here. So it really feels like I'm playing StarCraft to some degree, right? And all of these I'm just doing with my keyboard. And when I'm home, I'll just like be in Whisper, using Whisper, which is like this voice little thing that you see right here. And it just translates speech to text really quickly. Sometimes it's not that accurate, but so I'm just like switching, and I'm just basically talking to it, you know, just literally working as in multiple projects all at the same time. I think my bottleneck right now is really how much context switching I can do in my head. So yeah, another thing is enabling notifications. You could tell Claude Code to change the notifications, right? You could just say, change the notification to ring a little sound when you finish execution, for example. And then when it's now, it will basically ring like a little notification. And you could do a lot of things. At one point I had like text to speech where it like reads a summary of one of wherever it finished, it will read a summary. So I could be like, okay, I got to go back to tab 2 and then go do something. But that was too much, so I disabled it. Gig worktrees is another way to do multiple code execution. So one of the bottlenecks that you'll see is if you have these kind of like bunch of multiple instances, you'll soon realize if you're doing local development, you won't be able to make code edits to the same project unless you use Git worktrees. And I'll add some descriptions on how to use Git worktrees, but basically it's a way to like clone multiple instances of your code base and have like different forking branches. So you could have like, you could work on like code, like executions in the same project. /Chrome is actually a really cool tool in my opinion. So the way you get to it is by just doing /Chrome like this, and then it'll go to like /Chrome. And then it will open this thing. You can't see it here, but there's like a little button and it just opens it, and you could actually navigate the browser. So go to tip number 46. So what it does is it will look at the website and you could approve the plan. You could allow the action. So basically it will create the plan and then it will like do it. Okay, it doesn't really know how to do it. So I'll say let's just try YouTube. I think YouTube might be easier. Okay, so we'll open YouTube and then say, find a video on cooking, for example. Yep. So you can see that it like takes a screenshot. It will like click, it'll type cooking, and then it will like find cooking videos, for example. And then so I use this whenever I don't have API access to certain things, but I can get there via my web. And because you could control it via /Chrome, you can have it as part, like I mentioned, that all of these are composable. So you can have a command that goes to Chrome, scrapes a bunch of stuff, and comes back to you with the data. Okay, so moving on. Like I mentioned, it's really good for like debugging, right? You can navigate the web with it. That's also part of the validation thing that I was talking about. You can fill out forms and stuff. All right, hooks and automation is really just like kind of the cherry on top. And this is very similar to like GitHub's pre-hooks and GitHub's like post, like commit stuff, like recommit stuff. So basically these are hooks, and as you can tell, it's just like something to do before you start executing or after executing, and after executing fails. Like there's all these things that you can do, and you shouldn't manually do this. You should just ask Claude to like add these for you. You know, like go back to that principle that you're no longer manually maintaining your work environment. And a good example on what to put here for the PostToolUse is like, you know, things like like linting and formatting your code and things like that. And I'm not really using this yet, but basically this is really good if you want to block like removing your entire like database or something like that. It's just like good to prevent very destructive things. I haven't really set it up because, you know, I have like remote backups, and also this is like side projects. But for real work, you probably want something. And finally, with that, I think you got the vast majority of like the best tips that I know for Claude Code. The last thing I'll leave it with you is to explore the plugin ecosystem. All a plugin is just a combination of any of these composable things that I talked about, like a skill that triggers an MCP that triggers like Subagents or something like that. Or maybe there's like a bash script that's attached to a skill. That can all be turned into a plugin, and then a lot of people share their plugins online. So this is like a really good example. You know, Anthropic has their own like plugins like structure, and they have a bunch of plugins here that you could download, for example, like Call-in ISP and things like that. So that's basically it. And the last thing I want to say is context is king. You got to keep it fresh, keep it relevant. You essentially need to give Claude the context that it needs and nothing more. But yeah, so go and build something amazing. I hope this was valuable to you. I hope you learned something. Go and build something amazing. And if you're interested in this kind of video on Claude Code, I did a whole video on like kind of the high level thought process of like AI coding, and also talked a little bit about my second brain thing. Those two videos are right here, so go and check it out. But yeah, until I see you guys on the next video,